First, I'd like to welcome you to RLCT 2146, World Religions, Eastern Traditions. My name is Professor McCann, and I wanted to start by saying that I'm going to try to make the transition online as painless as possible for all of us. I've scheduled virtual office hours every Wednesday from 10 to 11:30 on Blackboard Collaborate. I can also be reached by email, or you can send me your phone number and we can speak on the phone. So don't ever hesitate to reach out to communicate with me if you're wanting to ask a question or you're not sure about something. So I want to start by going over the syllabus quickly, and then I'm going to be moving on to discussing the ideas of Orientalism and imagining the East. These are necessary theoretical ideas to understand as we look at the religious traditions that we're going to be going through in this course. So the textbook for the course is World Religions, Eastern Traditions, 5th edition, and is available at the Nipissing bookstore, and they'll send it to you by mail after you order it. As you can see from the syllabus, you'll first have a media assignment worth 10%, and then an Orientalism assignment worth 20%, a final essay worth 30%. So each assignment is going up slightly in value. You will also have a take-home exam worth 30%, and all are to be sent to Blackboard. The participation mark is based on 5 substantive comments made online on the forum on Blackboard under assignments, where you need to put in your comment on that discussion board. So if you have any questions, please contact me about that. There have been a number of controversies have been emerging over the last few years related to the way the media depicts certain other ethnicities and religions, and this actually has a long history. Most of us may have only heard about the controversies around the way Islam is depicted or not depicted in the movie Aladdin, or the character of Apu in The Simpsons, but in fact this kind of approach has a very long history, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So first of all, one way to get at this is to talk about the fact of why we call it Eastern traditions in my discipline of religious studies. So just to give you some idea, I had a job interview years ago where I was asked, was Islam an Eastern or a Western religion? Now, in my field, this is an incredibly loaded question, and I didn't get the job just as well, probably, because I said it was actually a Western tradition. It's an Abrahamic tradition related to Christianity and Judaism, but that wasn't how they understood it. So what do we actually mean when we say East? Of course, it has to do with where you're sitting. And so this whole concept comes from the Western world, and that's one of the key ideas that we have to grasp in this course. So to get at that, we need to give a really short history of colonialism and how this has impacted how we study religion. So the traditions that we're going to be looking at in this course have been profoundly shaped by the colonial enterprise, and the attempt to decolonize the curriculum is an ongoing and challenging task that many in the academy are participating in at the university level. And this is also a process of reimagining by the general public, because this influences all of us far outside the classroom and moves into politics and so on. So the defining political events in terms of the traditions we will be studying in this course is colonialism. You're probably all aware of what we call the voyages of discovery. You probably studied that in high school or middle school. Now, India was always considered to be the greatest prize, and if you recall, everybody was looking for India, and this resulted in wherever Columbus or a given explorer landed, they would say, oh, we've hit India, and call everybody there Indians, and it's caused a huge amount of confusion. Now, the desire to find a passage to India was motivated by the fact that South Asia was known for trading in spices and also for its wealth. And so Dutch, French, English traders were looking for a direct route to India. By the 19th century, Britain had become the dominant colonial power, and India was officially made a colony of Britain. So as a result of this, the British in India began to take on more and more of the function of rulers, although they never completely controlled the region. The British were also the first to sponsor the translation of the sacred texts, such as the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, other sort of central religious texts of Hinduism. So I want to move now into talking about Orientalism, which is one of the most influential books of the 20th century. It was published in 1978. It was written by Palestinian American scholar Edward Said. So Said was generally concerned with what we now call the Middle East, so the Arab nations, but his theory has been applied also to South Asia and beyond, because really the East was a projection of the Western imagination in many, many ways. The East was posited as the opposite of the West. So from this point of view, the East was dreamy, religious, lazy, erotic, and coded as female. So it was everything the West wasn't. The West was coded as rational, active, masculine. The logic then being that the so-called East was in need of control by the Western powers, and this becomes a kind of justification for colonialism. So Said wrote, the French and British, less so the Germans, Russians, Spanish, Portuguese, Italians, and Swiss, have had a long tradition of what I shall be calling Orientalism, a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in the European Western experience. The Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, it is also the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies, the source of its civilizations and languages, its cultural contestant, and one of its deepest and most recurring images of the other. So then the Orient becomes the image of the other, and it is the contrasting image, idea, personality, and experience. Yet none of the Orient is merely imaginative. It also became an integral part of European material civilization and culture. Orientalism expresses and represents that part culturally and even ideologically as a mode of discourse, with supporting institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, imagery, and even colonial bureaucracies and styles. So if you look at this painting, this is very typical subject matter of Orientalist painters, whether they're French or English or German, depicting a harem girl. And so we can see from her pose that she's being highly eroticized, and also she's open to the gaze. So the gaze is clearly coded as Western and masculine. There's a kind of pornographic aspect, obviously, to this picture. So you can see this painting in some ways encapsulates what Said's saying of how the East is being depicted as female, as erotic, and so on. Orientalism then can be expressed in architecture, in fashion, depictions in the media, and in literature. And so in this slide, we see a painting of a snake charmer. So that's another very common image that we see showing sort of the quote-unquote exotic East. So Said notes an aesthetic of the East which comes down to us in poetry, painting, and now in film and online. Spur quotes from a National Geographic article that is ostensibly about a drought in Somalia, but talks about it as a fabled land of frankincense and myrrh. We also see it in pictures in magazines like National Geographic, where even clearly hungry children are rendered as beautiful photographs. Outside of journalism, we find the work of Orientalist painters that we've already been looking at, and writers who render the East as mysterious, beautiful, and dangerous, with images of veiling and sensuality, and of harems and snake charmers. So the region is projected as an object of fascination and amusement. So as Said writes, the East also becomes a mode of artistic expression through literature, through painting, through music, through fashion, and so on. And we also find what American scholar David Spur refers to as the rhetoric of empire. And so he calls these colonial discourses, often used as a strategy of dominance and management. And so we see this in the forms particularly of travel writing done especially by missionaries in countries like India and China and Africa. So as Said notes, there's an aesthetic of the East, which comes down to us in poetry, painting, and now film and online. And even in articles that are ostensibly about a drought in Somalia, we hear language like, "It is the fabled land of frankincense and myrrh." Or we see images in National Geographic of clearly starving children that are still rendered as beautiful photographs. Orientalism then is expressed in architecture, fashion, and pictures in the media, including literature and film and online. American scholar David Spur notes that we still find what he calls in his book from 1993, The Rhetoric of Empire, and we find it in journalism and travel writing. He refers to these as colonial discourses and includes the ideas I will touch upon as strategies of dominance and management. And so we see this first in the writing, particularly of missionaries in countries like India and China. So Spur quotes from a National Geographic article that is ostensibly about a drought in Somalia, but talks about it as a fabled land of frankincense and myrrh. Also, we see dazzlingly beautiful photographs, so typically of National Geographic, in which even hungry children are rendered as beautiful photographs. It becomes important then to interrogate media and anything read on the internet while understanding this idea, because just looking at this picture, we can see it is very typical to depict in photographs and newspapers people from Muslim nations in groups like this, often with their mouths open and as a kind of angry mob. And this is a very, very common way of depicting people from regions such as the Middle East. So in chapter 5 of The Rhetoric of Empire, Spur titles it Filth and Defilement, and he writes that in the colonial discourse, the other, the people of the East, are often described as corrupt, tribal, with an inability to govern themselves. And he writes that the so-called belligerence of Arab nations, we are told, can be traced back to the violence and fanaticism of the Arab character, quote unquote. So he's very clear here that fear of the other is typical of all human beings. So he's not saying this is just strictly a Western problem, but that the West has had much more power and access to media than the countries of the so-called East. So we need to pay attention to how other religions, particularly religions like Hinduism or Islam, are depicted in the Western media. In this slide, we can see the coming together of a few different tropes. Again, it's a large group of people, again, with their mouths open. They're also wearing hijabs. So I've talked already about Said's idea of the East being depicted as feminine. And so this picture is picking up on a number of the tropes of the East. Again, we see a large group of people, again, many of them with their mouths open. And Spur talks about this idea of gender linked to the East, as does Said. And so he quotes from Jean Lorrain, writing in 1899 of the country of Algeria. He describes the country as a cunning and dangerous mistress. So again, we have these idea of the East as feminine, as fascinating, as dangerous, and as seductive. Kipling writes of an uprising in the Sudan in 1913. It was a hysteria of blood and fanaticism, and precisely as a hysterical woman is called to her senses by a dash of cold water, so the battle of Omdurman was reduced to sanity. So basically, Kipling is likening a battle to controlling a hysterical woman. And so you can see, again, the conflation of the East and the female, and that both are in need of control. So the image that we see here is taken from the animated version of Aladdin, and it actually caused a lot of controversy at the time regarding how Arabs were depicted in this animated feature. And this, again, is very typical, the exaggerated features, the kind of menacing expression of the character. And it's important to think about this in terms of when we often watch movies like this, it's when we're children. And so how does this impact the way we create and imagine the East? Because if these are the images that are being shown to us. It's interesting here to contrast how India is depicted versus the Arab countries. And so this is a very typical image. We often see charities using images like this. And this is to depict India as impoverished. And if you sort of look at the way it's depicted in the media and so on, this is often one of the major ways of describing India or imagining India as completely impoverished. Now, this is very interesting to think of this when, in fact, as I had just said, India was, in fact, extremely wealthy. And so that's precisely why the European nations wanted to go there. And yet, in the kind of Western imaginary, India is in need of assistance due to this impoverishment. And even to this day, there's a great deal of wealth in India. Now, it may suffer from income inequality, as does the United States and Canada. But the fact that this is so often the depiction tells us that we're dealing with another form of Orientalism. And we can't end this lecture without looking at Apu from The Simpsons. And people get very irritated with me talking in a negative way about Apu, I have found. However, if you look, I have put a link in the module for week 1, and there's a short documentary on No lecture on Orientalism would be complete without the character of Apu from The Simpsons, and I have found historically that some people get very annoyed when I take on this character. However, I'm hoping that you'll see, now that we've moved through the theory, how this fits very neatly into all the same Orientalist ideas. However, in this case, they've been moved into the United States. And so Apu is a kind of figure of fun because he's overly religious, he's irrational, and so on. So I've included in your week 1 module a link to a public television special on a documentary called The Problem with Apu. So it's about 10 minutes long, so you should have a look at that so that you can get a sense of what I'm talking about here. And this also moves us into the diaspora. And so this is when religions move outside of their country of origin. And so we can see that religions like Hinduism are often depicted in the media in this way.